religions. And so we wanted to talk about like where they came from and what they believe and how to reach them. And so we're mainly going to cover the two, really realistically, there are three major religions in the world today, and that's Christianity, Islam, and then there's Buddhism and Hinduism, and those two are kind of the same thing, but not really. They have different end goals, and we'll talk about that more when we get to that class. But so the purpose of this class, obviously, we can't sit here and go into the full details of Islam, in one night setting, especially when we start at like 7:30 and class is over at like 8 or a little bit before. So we're basically just going to be trying to come up with a general understanding of each of these religions, like where they came from, what exactly do they believe about certain things. Like with Hindus, they believe in reincarnation, same with the Buddhists, what that means and how all that plays out. But we're also going to try and talk about outreach efforts. So how do we actually reach these people and share the message of Christ with them? To begin with for tonight, I thought it would be important for us to really go back to the beginning to understand just exactly how this all plays out. And so obviously we start off in the garden, we're with God, we're in paradise, and then there's rebellion where Adam and Eve sin and they're exiled from the garden. And we kind of know this part of the story of sacrifice where Jesus gives himself to fully redeem us. And then eventually we get to spend eternity with God. But this is the part right here where all the rest of it kind of falls into place, isn't it? And so as we go through this process right here, this is where all of this is going to come from, is the rebellion. And so as people leave the garden, that part right there, in a way, it almost doesn't really matter to talk about that between the garden and the flood for this class in particular, because what happens in the flood? Everything's wiped out, right? So any religions that might have been established by that point, they're gone, okay? And so it doesn't really make sense to try and figure out, well, what do they believe? It doesn't matter. They're all dead. And so it really starts to boil down to what happened after the flood, right? You start to go down the table of nations, and you go through all these different descendants and everything, but realistically, I mean, all of it really just boils down to rebellion. Cain kills his brother Abel, right? What happens after that?
He's exiled to another land.
Yeah, it doesn't exactly tell us what's going on there, but it does say that Cain is, sent away to be a wanderer and everything else. And then he's got, later on, he has a descendant of his own. This should be in chapters 3 or, chapter 3 or 4, probably 4. Do you guys remember the name of Cain's descendant that comes up?
The guy from the video?
Which video?
Yeah, several wives.
Yes.
Right.
Lamech. Yeah. Right? And like Abby said, he's got multiple wives, right? Now, was that the intent? Was that God's intent for marriage, for multiple wives? No. He's boasting about it. He's got multiple wives, right? And so that's a no-no. And then what else comes up in that story? Do you guys remember? He specifically goes up to his wives and he says, listen to me. If Cain was punished for his action, I've gone and I've killed somebody just for insulting me. So if Cain was punished like that for his action, how much more am I going to be punished? And does he sound remorseful? Does he sound like he regrets his decision?
Then we go with no.
Yeah. He's a murderer and he doesn't care. Okay? And so, once again, he's got that going for him. And this is not just Lamech. This is something that continues in the habits and patterns of the people that we see up until the flood, and so God wipes everybody out. But after that, right? What's the first thing that happens as soon as Noah gets off the boat?
He gets drunk.
Yep. Right? So Noah gets drunk. He's not just drunk, he's what?
He's naked.
He's naked. He is so plastered, he is naked. Laying down in his tent, naked and drunk. Alright? That's how bad it got. And so God tells them, I give you everything, enjoy it. Noah decides I'm going to enjoy it a lot. Too much. Right? So then what happens?
His son's like laughing.
Yeah, it's just one son that laughs at him, right? Yeah. But yeah, his son
I can't remember his name.
starts with an H. Can't remember it either. Why am I not remembering this? Okay. Why am I not remembering this? I can't believe this. Okay, I'm just going to start it with H right there, and then I'm going to do Canaan. Okay? Because the son that does it is the actual son, but when Noah finds out about what happens, he curses Canaan. He curses the grandson. Okay? And so he comes in, he sees his dad naked, and instead of taking care of his dad and being the responsible son, he instead laughs. And Ham! That's the one. Yeah. All right. And I think part of the reason that it's written here that Canaan is the one that's listed is specifically because the author is intentionally trying to show, the people of Canaan are cursed by Noah. Okay? When you go through the table of nations, do you see a lot of names that look really familiar? Go into Genesis 10 real quick. If you got your Bibles on your phone or in your. Oops.
And was that the first one you
Nope, it's the last. Yeah. Okay, so go into chapter 10, Table of Nations. All right, and specifically, if you go into starting at verse 6, the sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Any of those names sound familiar? Which ones in particular?
Hold on.
Egypt.
Egypt. All right. Does that sound like a guy's name?
Egypt.
Right.
As a guy's name?
Yeah.
Sure.
Sure. Okay. I mean, it's possible that that's what the guy's name is, but remember that the style of the writing here is that they're trying to establish a certain chain of events. And so it's possible that it was the guy's name, but it's more likely that, again, the author is trying to establish the nations and where they came from. Okay? And so Egypt, the author is trying to say, came from Ham. And so that's why, same with Canaan, you see that in there as well. And so go into verse 8. So let me read verses 8 through 12.
Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that is why it is said, find Nimrod a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh,
Yeah, that'll work.
and Shinar. Oh, I read 10. What am I supposed to read to?
Yeah, keep going to 12.
From that land he went on to Assyria, where he built Nineveh. I don't know how to say that.
That's fine.
And rested, which is between Nineveh and Calah, which is a great city.
Okay. So, any of those names sound familiar?
Nineveh.
Nineveh. What's Nineveh?
Bad.
It's bad, right? It's not just bad, it's the capital of
Badness.
Evil. Sin.
Evil city.
Egypt.
Oh,
Egypt.
I thought you were like,
Assyria.
Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, right?
Assyria bad too.
Oh yeah. Assyria was the one that took
Israel.
Israel into captivity. Thank you. What's another one that's listed there?
Babylon.
Babylon, right? So let's hear. Yeah, Israel, and then Judah, and then you've got Babylon. Okay? What do you think the author is trying to do?
foreshadow.
Yeah, exactly. He's looking ahead into the future. He knows what's coming. Okay? And so they're trying to establish this fact that obviously these aren't good people, right? I mean, what do we know about? We know that Assyria and Babylon both took Israel and Judah into captivity. I mean, were they just kind of like, hey, come on over, we're gonna just take you over?
Oh, they raided them.
Yeah, no, it was terrible, right? In fact, it's so bad that even though God specifically says to them, hey, I'm sending Babylon or I'm sending Assyria to come and take over, they do it in such a brutal method that God says, you've gone too far. And God says, you're going to fall too. In fact, that's kind of the message that goes throughout a lot of the books of the prophets, is even though God is going to send this punishment through, that he kind of points to the nations as well and says, look, Israel was my chosen people. And if Israel was chosen and I punished them, how much more do you think I'm going to punish you if you don't do what's right? Okay? So, you've got all these different nations that are listed and coming up from Noah that come out of that. And then what do we have happen in chapter 11? What happens in Genesis chapter 11? What?
Tower of Babel.
Yeah, Tower of Babel, right? And what's the purpose of the tower?
Make a name for themselves.
Make a name for themselves, to not be scattered across the earth, to reach the heavens, right? And so God had told them right before this, I want you to fill the earth. And so once again, we see them rebelling. And so this is what all this really comes down to, is just this consistent rebellion against God. If you were to go throughout most of the different, especially the early world religions, you'll notice that a lot of them have similar features. A lot of them have flood stories. A lot of them have origins that start with a tree. A lot of them have origins that, or part of the religious system is involving sacrifice. Okay? And so, I mean, it stands to reason that they all came from the same place because they did, and because they all left from here, taking it all with them. Okay? But again, the whole, it's still rebellion. No matter how you look at it, there's no other way but rebellion. That they were told what to do. And it kind of gets back to the whole purpose of Abraham and his family, is that God has tried, to reconcile things with the world. He wanted Adam and Eve and all of their descendants to sit there and follow him, and instead they chose such horrible rebellion that God decided it was sad that he created everybody in the first place, and he wiped them out. And so then you get back to Noah, and God's trying to say, okay, let's try this again. And it doesn't work. And so God decides, and you still see it with Babel, that the people are still rebelling and still not doing what he says. And so God chooses one family, and it's based on Abraham's heart that God chooses him to be a chosen people, to spread his message throughout the world. Okay? So we've got Genesis 10 and 11 in Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34. This is where Paul is in Athens. Do you guys remember that story?
Kind of,
Kind of. What do you remember of that story?
but he was in Athens.
Thank you.
Did he get arrested there at all, or?
Not in Athens.
Okay, well, I was thinking Rome then, I guess.
Yeah, he's actually arrested in Jerusalem and then he's sent to Rome
Oh,
for trial. So Paul ends up in Athens because the previous city he was in, they actually were trying to kill him. And so they actually send Paul ahead of the rest, and they say, hey, just hang out in Athens, wait for us, and then we'll join with you. Okay? So Paul gets there, and he's walking around, and what does he see?
6 people in the marketplace or something?
Chapter 17, verses 16 through 34.
Oh, I was reading.
Wasn't it was that woman?
Oh, idols. He saw idols.
Yes, there you go. Yeah. He's seen idol after idol, right? And it's so bad that he gets to one spot and he sees an empty pedestal, right? Do you guys remember what's listed on the pedestal that's empty? Let's see, where does he say this?
To an unknown God.
There you go. Yeah, and it's because the Greeks are sitting there thinking, well, in case we miss somebody, here you go. Here's a pedestal just in case we missed you, and then we'll just say hallelujah or something to that effect, to this little spot here to recognize this unknown God that we haven't figured out yet. All right? But the reason I want to bring this up is specifically because this is this is a prime example in the text here of how to reach people that have a different belief. In a lot of the Gospels and a lot of the rest of the text, the letters and everything else, Paul's writing to people that are part of the church, right? But in this particular instance, you see him specifically engaging people that don't believe, or that aren't even members of the Jewish community. These are people that are complete pagans, okay? And Paul goes throughout the city first. Before he talks to them one bit, he goes throughout the city and he learns about them. He learns about their culture. And then he starts to speak to them. Does he do it in such a way that harasses them and tells them, you're all gonna burn? No. Obviously, it's clear that God never intended us for us to approach people like that. Okay? But he does it in such a way that they actually come up to him, and in verse 19, they say, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. Okay? And so then when he approaches them, he actually starts off in verse 22. People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. What does he start off with? You're idiots? What does he lead off with?
He talks about that God made the world and everything in it.
Okay.
So he kind of is pretty much telling them the story of creation.
Okay. Yeah. So now,
Not really the story, but he kind of mentions it.
yeah. Let's hear. Start in verse 22. What's the first thing that he says to them?
I see that you're very religious.
Yeah. Does that sound like an insult or a compliment?
Compliment. And then he calls him ignorant.
Yes. Then he says you're ignorant. Yeah. But he does it with the emphasis by building from the fact that they are worshiping an unknown God. And I think when he says that, let me go back to the text here. Let's hear. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. So he's not exactly saying that they're, idiots, but he's just kind of saying you don't even know what it is that you're worshiping. You just got this blank pedestal here. Okay? So he does kind of say you're ignorant, you're kind of stupid, but he's not really trying to tell them they're idiots. He's just stating a fact. So yeah, he goes on from there, and that's when he starts to tell them the message. Okay? And he really just kind of breaks it down from there, hitting the highlights. Right? We talked with in one of our devos before about one of the first things that we have to get people to believe is what?
That God is a creator.
Yep. That God exists. What do you think is the next thing we got to do?
Jesus, maybe?
Pretty much that God loves them. What do you think the next thing that we have to get across is?
Eternal life, maybe?
Okay.
Is that right?
I think that'd be a good one. Yeah, you could talk about holiness versus unholiness and how that relates to eternity. Because you could always link that back to this part right here about, God wants us to be with Him, and then unholiness, sin, separating us, and how God still wants us to come back. But we also have to get them to believe that the Bible is real, right? Because otherwise, most of what we're going to tell them doesn't matter, does it? And so that's kind of what Paul is getting at here. He's going back to the story and telling them the message that God has been telling the people for centuries. And so, we go through this process and we actually work through getting people to understand that God exists, that God loves them. And we tell them the story. But we have to do it in a way that obviously is not going to completely shut them down from the get-go. The thing for us is, John 14:6, that Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. You can see all these people that can try and sit there and say, well, you've got your way to heaven, I've got mine. That all paths lead to heaven is what some people will say. But obviously that's not the case. And some people even say that there's multiple ways within the church. But, the fact of the matter is that, we've talked about the covenant system, right? And there's the parties involved, there's the responsibilities and the signature. And the new covenant, what's the signature?
No.
What? Okay. All right. Let me pull this up again. Okay. So in the old covenant.
I should know this because we reviewed this.
That's okay. All right. So there's parties involved. There's the responsibilities and the signature. And signature. All right. Old Testament. Who are the parties in the Old Testament? God and who? Yep. God and Abraham, or Abraham's family, Israel. What are the responsibilities? Break it down into one word.
Obey.
There you go. All right, and the signature was?
There you go.
There you go. Circumcision, right? So that was the signature to the covenant. And we talked about how it was clear that this was something important because God tells Moses to go back to Egypt to rescue the people. And then on his way, Moses is about ready to die because of what? He sinned. He didn't circumcise his kids. And that's how serious this thing was, is that if Moses is going to be the leader of God's people, if Moses is going to try and say, this is who we are, this is our covenant, and Moses isn't going to even circumcise his own kids, that's death. That's how serious the signature is. So then we have in the New Testament, the parties are who? God and
Even Adam.
everyone. Okay? So God extends the covenant availability to everyone. Okay? And in fact, in the Old Testament, the covenant could be extended to people outside of Israel. They simply had to basically become Israel through circumcision and following the law and everything else. They never could be part of the priesthood, but they could be included within Israel, so to say. That's why whenever the Jews come and talk to Jesus about this Roman official, and they're asking him to heal his daughter, they say, you should do this, or the servant, and they say you should do this because he's a God-fearing man and he's done so much for the community, right? And so clearly there were Greeks and other people that were outside of Israel that wanted to follow God. But in the New Testament, it's specifically listed to everyone's available to do this. What's the responsibility?
Did it say obey?
Yep.
Oh, great.
The responsibility is the exact same thing. What's the signature in the New Testament? There you go. Okay? Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He's baptized by John the Baptist in the river, and John the Baptist initially argues and says, no. I need to be baptized by you. And Jesus instead comes back and says, let it be so now to fulfill all righteousness.
When you say responsibilities, so the New Testament would also be sacrifices.
Yeah. I mean, that would be part of the obedience that God commanded. I mean, that was part of
But
what was
to go to heaven, I mean, to be saved though, that you were saying that they need to be circumcised.
Well, it's the signature, but there's still the obedience afterwards. So just like today, we're baptized, but we still have to go and do God's will to live a life that serves others, that loves others, that takes care of the poor and the oppressed. It was the same for them. I mean, when that's in fact one of the big things in the prophets is that Israel was going off and going to the temple and making all these sacrifices, but were they taking care of the poor? No. In fact, they were going so far, and we'll get into this as we get into the prophets, is that they were not only just going off to the temple to sacrifice, their land or whatever. They would go and turn around and go outside of the city and say, Moloch, God of Canaan, here is my child. Throw him in the fire. They sacrificed their own kids. It was disgusting what they were involved in. And they tried to do both. And God said no. I don't care that you're circumcised. I don't care that you were my chosen people. You are clearly not living like my chosen people. You're not obeying what I've told you to do. And so Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. There is no other way. Okay? And so the main thing for tonight is basically just that. It's that any other way than obedience to God and what He has told us to do through His Word is rebellion, is to continue in that rebellion. But just like Paul, who approached the people and gently expressed to them, hey, this is why what you believe is wrong, he still expresses the message to them. In fact, I don't remember exactly where it is, but somewhere in Romans he specifically says, look, nobody's without excuse, because creation itself yields to the idea that there is God, that God exists. And so it's this thing that nobody has this excuse of, well, I didn't know. You should know. It's all around you. All right? So next week we'll cover Islam and just kind of really try and hit the basics of what they believe and how that affects the way that we reach out to them. Sunday we've got Guy Girl time. Your dad's not here tonight, is he?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try and reach out to him and find out if we're going to still go over to your all's place and do that, or if we're going to